Hi, we are back with So Be It by Sarah Weeks, and we are in the middle of chapter 15. Thurman Hill stood very still, looking at the photo in his hand, and as I watched, the color completely drained from his cheeks until his face was absolutely powder white. "Is this your mama here? She looks like you around the eyes," Ruby said, holding another of the photographs out to me. "And who's this other woman? She's got the same sweater on as you do. Is this your granny?" "That's enough," Mr. Hill said sharply, and he snatched the photos away from Ruby and gave them back to me. "What's got into you, Mr. Hill?" she asked, confused. "Take Elliot into the room with the others, Ruby," he said. Elliot had been sitting quietly in the chair, staring out the window at a bird that had landed in the yard. "Come on, Ellie," Ruby said. "You can have a snack. Cook has applesauce today. I know how you love applesauce." Elliot didn't move. He was watching the bird. "Elliot, go with Ruby, please," said Thurman Hill. "Bird," Elliot said. "Yes, son, that's a robin, remember," he said gently. "You can tell by the orange breast. Now I need you to go with Ruby." Ruby came around in front of Elliot and offered him both of her hands. Elliot took them and rose clumsily from the chair. I was surprised to see how small he was. His head didn't sit straight on his shoulders, and he held his arms in a funny way. His pants were pulled up high and fastened around his narrow waist with a leather belt, and he was barefoot. "That's it, Ellie. Come with Ruby," she said. "Wait," I said, turning to Thurman Hill. "If my mother was never here, how does Elliot know her word? He called me Soof." "Ruby, take Elliot to the rec room," Thurman Hill said, "and put some socks on him, please. These floors are cold." Ruby left then, holding Elliot by the hand like a small child. As soon as they were gone, Thurman Hill turned to me, and this time the look on his face was easy to read. He was angry. His mouth formed a tight, dark line which cut through his face like a colorless gash halfway between his chin and his nose. The sea-glass eyes flickered and flashed as he spoke. "You have no right to be here," he said. "No right?" I said. "I don't know what you're talking about." "She sent you here for more money, hasn't she? Well, she won't get another cent out of me, not one. You tell her promises have been made and paid for," he answered. His fists were balled up now like two tight white rocks. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said. "Bernadette called and wrote, but you wouldn't answer us. That's the reason I came. I don't know anything about promises." "Bernadette, is that what she's calling herself now?" he said with a strange, hollow laugh. "Well, she can call herself by any name she wants, but it doesn't change a thing. I tore up those letters and ignored her for a reason. I won't have her coming around here stirring up trouble. Not for me, not for Elliot, not now." Just then a small woman in a blue dress and white sneakers pushed open the door and came running into the room. "Come quick, Mr. H," she said. "Elliot's having a tantrum. Ruby told me to come and get you." Her face was round like a plate, and her eyes sloped down at the corners, making her look sad even when she turned and smiled at me. "Hello," she said. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but Mr. Hill really has to come now." In the distance, I heard what sounded like an animal howling. Thurman Hill put his hand on her shoulder and spoke gently to the woman. "I'll be there in a minute, Sally," he said. "Go back and tell Elliot I'm coming." "I'm afraid he's going to hurt himself," she said. "I know. I'll be there in a minute," he said. Then he turned back to me, and his voice was hard again. "I've done my part," he said. "Now you go do yours. Leave us alone. For God's sake, just leave us alone." Thurman Hill left me standing in the alcove feeling completely lost. I tried to make sense of the things he'd said, but I couldn't. He thought Bernadette was someone else. He thought I'd come for money. Who did he think I was, and why was he so angry? The howling grew louder, and there was a rhythmic thumping now, too, like someone banging something hard against a table or the wall. "Elliot!" I heard Thurman Hill cry. "Don't!" I'm not sure how long I stood there before Ruby came back in. She didn't say anything. but after a quick look over her shoulder, she pulled open one of the drawers in the gray filing cabinet and began to flip quickly through a section of folders. She went through once and then a second time as I held my breath. Nothing under it. Should be here if your mother was at Hilltop 13 years ago, because these go back 15. But there's no it. Are you sure? I asked, coming over to stand by her. I'm positive. She pushed against the drawer with one well-padded hip in a vain attempt to close it. Nothing even close, and I looked through twice. I'm sorry. I could tell she meant it, but I just couldn't believe Mama wasn't in there somewhere. She had to be. Elliot knew her word. She was in the photographs. She'd been here. I was sure of it. May I look for myself? I asked, just in case you missed something. Ruby looked nervously toward the door. I don't think that's a good idea, she said. Please? I took a step toward the filing cabinet. Afternoon, everybody, said a deep male voice from the doorway. I turned around and saw an officer in a gray uniform with a wide-brimmed hat and a gold badge on his shirt. He had a gun in a black leather holster strapped around his waist. You ready? He said. Thurman Hill must have called the police and told them some lie about me being somebody I wasn't. Or maybe he'd told them I'd run away, just so they'd come and get me and he could get rid of me. I didn't know whether people got put in jail for running away or not, but I wasn't about to hang around and find out. I pushed past all of them and ran for the door as fast as I could. Chapter 16. Hot. I was halfway down the driveway, running with my backpack slung over one shoulder, the suitcase in one hand and the jelly beans under the other arm, when Sheriff Roy Franklin, Ruby's husband, finally caught up with me. He'd come to pick up his wife from work. Please don't take me away, I pleaded as he closed a huge hand around the top of my arm and steered me back around toward Hilltop. Calm down, he said. Nobody's taking anybody anyplace. I just want to talk to you. Ruby had come out on the front porch and was watching us walk back up the driveway. Roy carried my suitcase and I had the jar of jelly beans in my arms. I wasn't crying, but I was close. Can I call Bernie? I called. Who's Bernie? He said. By then we'd reached the porch where Ruby was waiting and she started to fill Roy in on my story. Bernie's the neighbor, she told him, in Nevada. She took a bus here by herself, Roy. Does your family know where you are? Roy asked. Yes, but Bernie's going to be worried, I told him. I was supposed to call her back a long time ago. Please, can I call her now? I think maybe that's a good idea, Roy said. We went back inside to the little office so I could call Bernie. To my relief, there was no sign of Thurman Hill anywhere. Oh, Heidi, Bernie said as soon as the call went through. Where on earth have you been, baby? Are you all right? You were supposed to call me back ages ago. I lost it and began to cry. I'm at Hilltop, Bernie, with a sheriff. Thurman Hill is awful and he won't tell me anything. He thinks I'm somebody else. He thinks I want his money. And Mama's not in the files. I want to come home, Bernie, I sobbed into the phone. I want to come home. Ruby pulled a tissue out of the sleeve of her sweater and handed it to me. I blew my nose and tried to catch my breath. Let me speak to her, Roy said, reaching for the phone. I handed it to him and stood there sniffling and dabbing at my eyes as Ruby handed me more tissues. Roy stretched the phone cord out and moved a few feet away, then turned his back to me and kept his voice so low I couldn't hear what he was saying to Bernadette. My clothes were damp from the downpour I'd been caught in back in town, and I was shivering. Ruby went and made me a cup of instant hot chocolate in the kitchen, and when she came back she brought her coat and wrapped it around my shoulders. It was warm and soft and smelled flowery, like George's breath after she ate a violet. Roy talked to Bernadette for quite a while, and I stood there drinking my cocoa and trying not to cry again. When he finally finished, he handed me the phone. I think I know the answer to this already, but tell me, what are his eyes saying, baby? Bernie said. It's important. Sheriff Roy Franklin was a big man with black hair growing gray on the sides and a large mustache that hung over both of his upper and lower lip. His eyes were large and brown, dark like the color of the ground beans in the drawer of Bernie's coffee mill. And when he smiled, little lines formed at the outer corners. "Good things," I said. "That's what I thought," she said. "Well, that's one remarkable lady," Roy said after I hung up. "Wants what she wants, though." "What did I tell you?" I asked. He reached into his pocket. At first I thought he was going for his handcuffs, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. But then he pulled out a quarter. "Heads or tails?" he asked me. "What?" "Heads or tails, call it in the air," said the sheriff, as he flipped the coin, caught it, and then slapped it down in the back of his other hand and covered it. "Heads," I said. He looked at it and nodded. "Do it again. Heads or tails?" "Tails," I said. Again I was right. He did it 10 times in a row, and each time I got it right. "What on earth, Roy?" Ruby said. "I'll be danged. It's just like she said," said Roy. "Like who said?" asked Ruby. "Bernadette, the neighbor. She bet me this little girl could guess 10 coin flips correctly in a row, and sure enough she did. Guess I've got no choice but to keep my part of the bargain." "What bargain?" asked Ruby. "I promised Bernadette that if she guessed 10 flips in a row, instead of taking Heidi down to the station like I'd planned to, I'd take her to our house, feed her a home-cooked meal, and give her a warm bed to sleep in for the night." "Roy," Ruby said. "What, Rube? You don't want her to have to bunk downtown, do you? She's 12 years old and a couple thousand miles from home." "Of course not," said Ruby softly. "It's just we don't know the whole story yet." "I know enough of it to know what's best right now. As for your boss, I need to talk to him. Where is he, anyway?" "Oh, he's probably back in the rec room. Ellie's having a hard time this afternoon," Ruby said. "He's been banging his head." "You meet Elliot yet?" Roy asked me. I nodded. "Rube's sweet on him, in case you can't tell," Roy said. "I'll be back in a minute. I've got to go have a word with Mr. Hill." "Ask him why Elliot knows my mama's word," I said. Roy looked to Ruby for an explanation. "Soof," she said. "You know how I told you Elliot says that a lot? Well, Heidi says her mother does too. And he called me Soof today when he saw me," I said. "Elliot says Soof a lot, Heidi. It probably doesn't mean anything," Ruby said. "I think it does. I think everything means something, even when you don't know what it is," I said. Roy smiled at me. "Why don't you two wait out in the car?" He handed Ruby the keys. "Put the heater on, Rube. She's shivering." And I'll stop there, and we will finish the rest of this chapter next time.